Yeah, hi folks. Now, wasn't that Novak Djokovic debacle a complete and utter mess? Now, when I first heard the story, I thought he was just another elitist trying to get special treatment, and still I started digging around a bit more. Now, on the one hand, you could argue that Tennis Australia and Djokovic both had incentives to scam the system, but equally, so did Scott Morrison. He had a lot to gain politically, and he milked it all the way. Now, this is how I understand it. On December 16, Djokovic contracted COVID-19 and had evidence of that. On December 30, he received a letter from Tennis Australia saying he had been granted a vaccine exemption to enter Australia. On arrival in Australia, however, it all went to custard. He was not granted entry. Now, this is where I think it got really, really messy.
Novak Djokovic was able to get on a plane, which means that he had a visa.
Yeah.
And he had to have this exemption, as I understand it, registered with Services Australia. Can you just explain to us how it was that he was able to actually travel here? And does that mean that these bits of paperwork aren't actually processed before somebody boards a plane?
No. The way it works is this. People try to run the border all the time, by the way. You know, people come with a visa but may not satisfy other requirements for entry. And people are put on planes and turned back all the time. Anybody who's watched the Border Patrol shows will understand that. This is not an irregular thing to happen if someone is put on a plane and told to return to their country, even if they may have come with a valid visa. A visa is one issue, but you have to have a double vaccination, because that's the country's rule for entry into the country, and that is assessed at the border. And we don't have Border Force officers in every airport around the country. And he provided information to the airline to allow his entry onto the plane. But people get on that plane. That is not an assurance that they'll be able to come through Australia's border at the other side. Wasn't a problem necessarily with the visa. There are many visas granted. And if you have a visa and you're double vaccinated, well, you're very, very welcome to come. And I think what this says to everybody in Australia, people are welcome in Australia. But if you're not double vaccinated and you're not an Australian resident or citizen, well, you can't come. And many countries have those rules around the world, and we have them, and they've been very important for securing Australia during the course of this pandemic. And so it is on them to have the proof to show why they wouldn't have to be vaccinated. Now, he was unable to furnish that proof to the Border Force officers.
Why? Did he leave his paperwork behind or something?
At the airport last night, and they're the rules, and it happens on many occasions, and that's what's now happened.
Can you explain then the argy-bargy at the airport, which seemed to be about sort of a group visas that have been processed somehow, and this suggestion from the federal officers to the Victorian bureaucrats that it could be a get-around if Victoria was prepared to sponsor an individual visa application from the tennis player?
No, I mean, the Border Force has already rejected that scuttlebutt, as I understand it. There was no inquiries being made about support for a visa application, I'm advised. There was inquiries being made about whether quarantine was going to be waived. And to my knowledge, I still don't know whether the Victorian government were proposing to waive quarantine. I'm not making any comment on that. And that wasn't the basis of any decisions taken. And in relation to any advice he may have received from Tennis Australia, well, releasing the letter, I mean, the letter makes very clear that it was written back to Tennis Australia in November. And I'll read it out to you. People must be fully vaccinated as defined by the ATAGI to gain quarantine-free entry into Australia. This means that people who do not meet the ATAGI definition of fully vaccinated will not be approved for quarantine-free entry, regardless of whether they have received foreign vaccine exemptions. In relation to the specific questions that were raised by Tennis Australia, this is from the Minister for Health, I can confirm that people who contracted COVID-19 within the past 6 months and seek to enter Australia from overseas and have not received 2 doses of a TGA-approved or TGA-recognised vaccine are not considered fully vaccinated.
But Atagi doesn't say that. Listen to what I recorded yesterday, and also note how Qantas has just changed their exemption definition. Atagi, Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation. Temporary exemptions for all COVID-19 vaccines. PCR confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID-19, where vaccination can be deferred until 6 months after the infection. And Qantas said virtually the same yesterday. So we have Qantas. Atagi recommends that vaccination can be deferred in those with PCR-confirmed SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 infection until complete recovery from the acute illness, which may be up to 6 months, regardless of disease severity. But this is what they say today. Conditions not considered to be a contraindication for COVID-19 vaccination and not accepted for the purpose of a medical exemption to vaccination for travel to Australia. Previous infection with COVID-19, PCR confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection. In the case of recent COVID-19 infection, vaccination may be temporarily deferred until the resolution of the acute illness. Now, what the hell does that mean? That is complete doublespeak. Anyway, now to Tennis Australia.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out here today. Just want to introduce, you all know, the Acting Sports Minister. Jala will make a statement following my introduction, and then Dr. Carolyn Broderick, our Chief Medical Officer. So the news overnight has been fairly significant. Obviously, the announcement by Novak that he has been granted a medical exemption, and that exemption affords him the opportunity to come into Australia, come into Victoria and compete at the Australian Open. So he's currently on a flight on his way here and gets here sometime today. I wouldn't mind just quickly going through again what we discussed this morning, a little bit on the process and how we've got to this point. We have been saying from the beginning that anyone coming into Australia or coming onto the grounds on the Melbourne Park precinct would have to be vaccinated or would have to have a medical exemption and approved by a medical practitioner or by a medical panel. And we set up, Tennis Australia set up the first panel, and that panel was designed, made of independent doctors, epidemiologists, was designed to assess any application that was received. They were blind applicants that were received. In other words, no one knew who the applicant was. That was reviewed and assessed and then passed on to the second panel, which was set up by the government for further assessment. That's not a process that the normal, an Australian coming home or anyone coming into Australia, that would not be the process. Simply they would have to apply directly to medical practitioners to have their name eventually added to the Australian Immunisation Register. And when that gets added, then you, for all intents and purposes, considered vaccinated, and you can get the green tick that all of us have as vaccinated individuals. There were 26 applicants through the process. There's a handful which were provided with an exemption, and that handful, that information only gets disclosed by those individuals on the grounds of which they were provided an exemption. That's personal, private, confidential medical information that we are not at liberty to share publicly. But it's very clear on the Atagi guidelines, it's very clear on what conditions you would receive an exemption on. And to briefly, quickly summarize those, one of them is obviously having an adverse response to any kind of vaccine and having something like an anaphylactic response. Another one is if you've just had major surgery and may or may not be suffering from myocarditis. And another one is you're a recovered case. In other words, you've had evidence of COVID and certified evidence of COVID over the past 6 months. If you meet any of that criteria, then it's assessed by the medical team, and Dr. Broderick can provide some of that information, but it's assessed by the medical panel, both panels, and if it's granted, then you're given an exemption, and then that becomes communication between the applicant and the panel at that point. So the process has been very clear, and we completely understand and empathize with first of all, some people being upset about the fact that Novak has come in because of his statements over the past couple of years around vaccination.
The best men's tennis player in the world has been caught up in a legal battle in Australia as the first of this year's Grand Slam tennis tournaments is poised to begin. Novak Djokovic is not vaccinated. He is a skeptic. Australian officials are not skeptics and demand proof of vaccination to enter the continent. Nick Schifrin tells us more.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Novak Djokovic.
He is one of the world's most famous athletes, but also one of its most famous vaccine skeptics, as he told fellow Serbian athletes on an April 2020 Facebook Live.
Personally, I'm opposed to vaccination. I'm curious about well-being and how we can empower our metabolism to be in the best shape to defend against imposters like COVID-19.
Yep, that's about it. They always point to that clip as being something
terrible. However, it's ultimately up to him to discuss with the public his condition if he chooses to do that and the reason why. He received an exemption. We as an event, also as a state and as a country, will do everything we possibly can to give everyone an equal and fair opportunity to come into the country. And if they come in and they come in through the guidelines that are set forth and the conditions of which they can compete, then they're granted with an exemption. The majority of players and the majority of people on site are vaccinated because, again, to come into the grounds and all our patrons coming in, the critical workforce, the players coming in will have to show, through the QR code, will have to show the services, through the Services Vic app, will have to show the green tick. And you also get that green tick if you're medically exempt. So we don't single out someone if they're medically exempt, and that applies not only to players, their support staff, and fans as well. And that's the right process. And we're confident with what we put forward, and in close partnership with the Victorian government. And tennis has gone above and beyond what would normally be required coming into the country. So,
anyway, I'll just fast forward a bit.
But in relation to the panel process, this is vastly more robust again. So instead of going to a doctor that you know and that you perhaps know well and that knows you, the applicants have had their information redacted, so it's all de-identified. They're considered by not one doctor that you know, but 6 doctors that you don't.
Yeah, that's pretty tough. Now, I think these guys have done a reasonably good job, so I really don't understand why they've been targeted. Anyway, now to Avi Yamini.
He is the reigning Australian Open champion, and he cannot play because he is unvaccinated. Now, our next guest has been covering the story from the beginning. He has great insight into the entire lockdown going on 2 years and insanity in Australia. His name is Avi Yamini. He's the chief Australian correspondent for Rebel News, and he joins us now from Melbourne. Avi, great to have you on the show this morning. I'm just going to turn it over to you. What's your reaction as you see what's happening in Australia this morning?
Well, thanks for having me. It's been an insane week, but a couple of corrections. It's not actually that the government appealed it and won the appeal. That's not true. When he came in, they tried to ban him, saying his vaccine exemption was invalid. When he appealed that, he won in the Federal Circuit Court. And what then transpired is the government claimed that he'd lied on his papers to get into the country in his documentation. But that's not even what they came after him at the end.
Yeah, it's quite ironic, really, because that was probably a valid reason for him to be deported.
And the Minister of Immigration exercised his discretionary power to remove Novak Djokovic for the reason that his mere presence in the country would essentially incite dissent. He said, citing that he was a risk to civil order. So him being here, not that he was unvaxxed, but that people perceived his way of thinking, his belief to be anti-vax, and that could inspire people not to get vaccinated in a country where we're, 90%, or in a state 93% vaccinated. It is crazy what happened here today.
Yeah, I mean, everything in Australia seems crazy to me these days. I guess my question to you is, I get how the government feels about this. It's a little surprising in the post-Omicron era where we now know that the vaccinated are spreading it. But how do the Australian people feel about it? Where do they stand? Because this was such an international story that put a spotlight on what they've been going through as well.
I think a lot of Australians were really angry in the beginning when Novak got an exemption because, as I said, over 90%, at least in Victoria, are double vaccinated. And that's not because people chose to. It's because pretty much to live life here, you need to be fully vaccinated.
And the same applies in New Zealand.
People felt like they were forced to get vaccinated, but then this superstar came here and he was given an exemption. I think the federal government here rode that wave and felt like they had an opportunity to win some political points, and they essentially went to take him out on the most bizarre reason. It's not, again, that he's unvaccinated. That today the immigration minister conceded that his vaccination exemption was absolutely kosher. It was fine. It was over the fact that they said he was potentially inciting dissent. And one of the things that they cited as evidence, which I found quite interesting, is that before the vaccines were even available, that he'd questioned the idea of a vaccine, or he said that he was no expert, but he would see at the time, but he wasn't really interested in vaccines. That was the only real evidence that the state had that he was ever kind of anti-vax. The interesting thing is that was at a period of time that Joe Biden and every Democrat in America was having a go at the vaccines. It was during the period that Trump was talking about the vaccines. And back at that time, being anti-vax was actually the right kind of position to have. So it is a really, really bizarre situation that's happened here. But there is, listen, a lot of people were angry about Novak being here.
Yeah, he was targeted for his belief. Now that sounds much the same as what happened to Israel Folau. Shocking.
I think Australians are going to look back at this period with a lot of shame.
Avi, you raised so many great points. This idea that he would incite dissent. Dissent is something Americans are quite proud of, although it's been being squelched here as well, and we've seen it actively by big tech. But the fact that the government would say dissent not allowed, what does that tell you about the current state of politics, of power in Australia? A lot of people look over at Australia and don't recognize a thing we used to think it was.
It's nowhere near what it was anymore.
Look, I lived here my whole life and I don't recognise it. The last 2 years has absolutely changed Australia, and day by day it gets worse. As we're coming out of this pandemic, as we're learning to live with it, it seems like we're being stripped more and more of basic fundamental human rights. And it's really, really sad. And I hope, like probably many Aussies, that we come out of this okay and we're able to get back the Australia we once had, but it is looking harder and harder as we go forward.
Yes, it really is a shame to see Australia go downhill so fast. It's no longer an improvement on New Zealand. Scott Morrison is not so different to Ardern, who, by the way, has already said she will use the red traffic light setting to control Omicron. Lockdowns are on their way.